Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. If India backs out of the Indo-US nuclear deal, what would be the reaction in Washington and in the major capitals of the world? That's one of the issues I shall raise today in an interview with America's former Secretary of State and someone they consider the best-known holder of that office for perhaps a century, Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, let me start by asking you, if the Indo-US nuclear deal goes through, how important a landmark would that be in the relationship between the two countries?
I think it would be an important landmark. It would signify that India has emerged from its isolation of 30 years and that in a major field of activity, maybe a key field of activity, the nuclear field, it is now re-entering the international community in a cooperative manner. And it would signify a role for India on a more global basis than it has performed before.
So this, if I hear you correctly, is sort of recognition that India has arrived. Could any other country other than America give this to India?
Well, I don't think that, well, there are two separate problems. Technologically, there may be other countries that can give part of it and where one could piece together various aspects from a number of other countries. Politically, in relation to the nuclear suppliers groups, to the IAEA, I think cooperation between India and the United States would facilitate matters in a degree that I don't believe any other cooperative relationship would.
Now, for the sake of an Indian audience that may not fully know the details, how much effort would the Bush administration have put in? How much political goodwill would they have used to overcome the powerful non-proliferation lobby in America?
Well, first, I'd like your audience to understand, I'm not here to promote a particular agreement. This is an important agreement which will have to be ratified by Indian internal processes for Indian reasons. America has its reasons, and then they have to be compatible. For the American administration, it was a very important step. India had been under sanctions, and that had developed in previous administrations in America. And therefore, to change the mindset in which an exception is made for India to some extent on the proliferation issue, and in which from a position of ostracizing India, one moves towards cooperation with India, that had to overcome significant domestic difficulties, both among experts and within the Congress. And the Bush administration does consider that a major initiative of which they're proud. Not even primarily for the nuclear issue, but for the cooperation between our two countries.
Given what you're saying, if India were now at this late stage to back off from the deal and shelve it, what would be the reaction in Washington?
Two separate reactions. The first is India will still be considered important, and serious efforts would be made to continue a close relationship. But theoretical desires for close relationships have to be expressed in concrete measures at some point. And there would be undoubtedly a mixture of disappointment and also of whether a question to what extent one can calculate Indian reactions to negotiations that are going on other subjects. I think those would be the two dominant reactions.
Would there be voices in Washington that would hereafter question India's reliability as a strategic partner? Would there be people who'd say they went so far down the road and then they backed off? Can we trust them the next time around?
Well, there are certainly people who will make that argument. There are others who would say the relationship is very important and we have to carry on. But it certainly would in an intangible way affect calculations, because when an American leader goes down a certain road, he stakes his prestige on the ability to get it executed. So in that sense, it would be undoubtedly a setback. But I want to stress again what I said earlier. India should ratify this or not for its own reasons, not for American reasons.
Absolutely, but given that President Bush has staked his credibility on pursuing this deal and delivering it, if India then is seen not to fulfill its side of the bargain, not to deliver on its commitment, that would be a setback, and that would perhaps not just disappoint, but perhaps irritate members of the Bush administration.
It would certainly be a disappointment, because the Bush administration has put a lot of effort behind this. But India should do it for its own reasons, as I've said before. And I think it is important for both countries to proceed. India and the United States have parallel goals in many areas, and that therefore it would be unnatural to keep India under a sanction regime and exclude it from one of the major future areas of technological achievement. And this is why this effort was made to bring India, or to enable India to enter this field on a bigger scale than before.
Now, as you know, Dr. Kissinger, India has been canvassing major international capitals for almost 2 years to get support for this deal. The Prime Minister has sent special envoys to a variety of countries. Would they share the dismay, the disappointment?
Well, they would wonder what is going on and what that reflects. Does it reflect an immediate internal Indian problem, or does it reflect a fundamental Indian choice which makes it difficult to cooperate with India on these issues?
And those are serious questions that would be raised.
Those are issues that people would have to answer for themselves, yes.
And what impact would this have on India's ambition to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and to be recognized as one of the great nations, perhaps even great powers of our time?
Well, I must tell you, if, to the extent that I'm an expert in this field and would be asked, I would say India should, and I would anyway be in favor of India joining the Security Council because of the magnitude of the country. But it would certainly be one argument that opponents might use to what is in any event a complicated issue because of issues of veto and expansion of the Security Council and so forth.
So in a sense, this would feed India's enemies. It would create doubt where doubt is not needed. It would therefore be unhelpful.
It would give an argument to people who would not like to see an expansion of India's role, or who simply don't want the Security Council changed for other reasons because it's too difficult to change it anyway.
Now, the left in India say that if this is such a good deal, it can safely be left to the next American administration. If the next American president is a Democrat, and you know the Democrats quite well, what are the chances that he or she might actually choose to renegotiate this deal?
Well, there are two separate problems. One is, what happens if this agreement is delayed or put off? The second is, which of the political parties in America are likely to act. Now, there are certain, the first thing is the American political process. Anything that is not ratified by next July is unlikely to be dealt with before 2009. It is then unlikely to be dealt with in 2009 at first because a new administration has to reorganize itself. There's 3,000 jobs that have to be filled. And the Congress has to get organized. So that in any event, even if the Republicans come in, would be a delay of at least a year and a half. Secondly, it is broadly true that the anti-proliferation group is stronger in the Democratic than in the Republican Party. So a Democratic president would have to deal with that group, and that's another delay. And I don't want to say that friendship with India is a monopoly of the Republican Party. That's certainly historically not true. But given the present political constellation, what doesn't happen within this current time frame will be delayed 2 and more years.
And you're also suggesting, aren't you, that if there is delay, there is a real likelihood that the terms that would eventually be on offer to India might be not as good as those on offer today.
There will be a need to take into consideration the opposition as it applies to the new administration, of course.
Dr. Kissinger, let's take a break at that point. I want to come back after the break and put to you 2 reasons why people in India are advising against the deal, and ask you, how do you respond to those? That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with America's former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, let's broaden our discussion. Much of the opposition to the deal in India arises out of the fear that embracing America too closely might be dangerous for Delhi to do. In other words, America is a friend best kept at a judicious distance. How do you respond to that sort of thinking?
Well, I belong in America to the realist school of foreign policy. I think countries should do things not for sentimental reasons, but in considering their own national interest. And I expect that from my country, and I expect that from India. So I don't look at this as embracing the United States. I look at this agreement as something that is in the Indian interest, but that enables a common interest to be more easily realized by establishing a pattern of cooperation. But the judgment should be done on the basis, is it in India's interest? Not, are we embracing the United States? It should be done on its merits.
The problem is that when you talk about a hard-headed, realistic attitude, India's former National Security Advisor, Brajesh Mishra, told me in an interview a couple of months ago that there's a real danger that if India goes down this road and enters the deal, it will be under constant pressure from Washington to toe an American line. And the sort of issues he mentioned were Iran, Iraq, even the general attitude to democracy, the Middle East. Would America look for political quid pro quos?
I would be, America certainly, as any great country, will try to get Indian support on the issues that concern America. That's a tribute to India's importance. Will it try to blackmail India by withholding technical cooperation? That would be very foolish and, in my view, hard to conceive, because once one does that once, the relationship is broken. And we should try to get cooperation with India on Iran and similar matters, but on its merits, not by blackmail.
Let me quote to you what Tom Lantos said last year. He said, India must reassure Congress and the American public that it knows full well what it means to be a strategic ally of the United States. To Indian ears, that sounds like a not-so-subtle threat.
The only way great countries can cooperate is if they genuinely believe they're pursuing common interests. If one country blackmails the other, even if it succeeds on one issue, it mortgages the future. The problem between India and the United States is, how do we conceive our objectives, say between Singapore and Aden, in that whole region? Are there enough common interests to pursue parallel policies? If those interests don't exist, we won't create them through a nuclear agreement. And that is the fundamental issue in Indian-American relations, and why I believe that we are now moving into a period where each for its own reasons will conclude that on many issues cooperation is desirable, but not blackmail.
So you're saying to Indians who worry about the embrace, don't worry about imaginary ghosts?
I say to India, think through what your objectives are, and listen to what we say our objectives are, and then decide whether they're sufficiently parallel. And you have certainly demonstrated over the decades that you're not embarrassed to disagree when you do.
Quite right. You're also saying don't underestimate your capacity to stand up to America. There is another fear that's expressed, and this time by the Bharatiya Janata Party, the main opposition party. They say that the deal is in fact an attempt to trap India by the back door into the NPT. It's an attempt to emasculate India's strategic nuclear weapons program.
There's no doubt that there are people in the United States who have that view. The non-proliferation lobby has a strong view along that line. But in this agreement, the argument that is made in America is the opposite, that it enables India to pursue a strategic program with much more flexibility. And that is the argument that opponents in America make.
So in other words, once again, don't listen to every voice and believe it. Judge the agreement on its merits. Think carefully about the conclusions you're coming to, because you might be frightening yourself where there's no need to be scared.
I think the agreement ought to be judged on its merits, on its technical merits, and on its long-term foreign policy merits. And the United States has gone through a similar process and has resolved to be in favor of it. And now it's India's turn to complete its process.
Very quickly before we end this interview, as a foreign policy analyst, what would you say to a party like the Bharatiya Janata Party, which 4 years ago when it was in power, used to call America India's natural ally? Today, 4 years later, they want to turn their back on the nuclear deal. What would you say to them?
Well, I will be seeing some of the leaders of that party. I will try to avoid getting involved in the debate on the deal. I would talk as I did then, and as I do to the current government, on are there parallel interests between India and the United States? And let's look at this agreement on how we best realize these and what is the impact of India turning its back with arguments like the ones you have mentioned to me. And you should make that choice, not I.
And would you make the same message to the Prime Minister were you to meet him? Would you say the same thing to him?
I say the same thing to everybody.
Think about your interests, carefully judge what you're doing, and worry about the consequences that you may not intend.
Well, I have now dealt with India for many decades, and India has never been lacking making a hard-headed assessment of its long-term interests. And that has been one of the impressive aspects of the Indian performance, and I'm sure that will continue.
Dr. Kissinger, a pleasure talking to you on Devil's Advocate.
Nice to see you.